Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going to discuss economic transformation in the northern part of the United States, the northern states, in the early to mid 19th century. This is going to be a big, broad overview, not a lot of narrative in this lecture or in the next one. The next one will look at economic transformation in the South. So, what we're going to be looking at is what historians sometimes call the market revolution in the United States. Now, what does this mean? It doesn't mean the markets are invented in any way in this time, but it means there's an acceleration of ongoing economic processes in the early 19th century. And the catalyst for this change, this revolution, are innovations in transportation and in communications, okay, that lead to a big change in how the United States is able to get products to market, both domestic markets and international markets, but also changes in how it's producing goods. And one of the underlying points that apply to both of these next two lectures is the growing sectional difference in economic development happening in the two sections of the country. I've mentioned this theme of sectionalism before, going all the way back to the beginning of the course, and how the northern and southern colonies developed in different ways. And we're going to see that accelerate here in the 19th century. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're going forward. Okay. So, in the first decades after the War of 1812, the U.S. economy experienced a dramatic economic transformation, again, what historians sometimes call the market revolution. And it happened in both the North and the South, though its effects on the economies of those regions are different. And these, again, would heighten the sectional differences over time. As Americans are moving west, remember, Americans are continuing to move west towards the Mississippi River, but they're finding themselves increasingly isolated from markets to the east and isolated from being able to easily get their products to markets in the east, but also overseas to overseas markets. Okay, so this is a big challenge, and there's not a lot of it's not very easy to get goods to market, particularly the further inland that you go away from the coasts. Okay, at the start of the 19th century, most roads were just simply rutted paths. And apart from ships on the Atlantic coast and a few flatboats floating on rivers, trade was difficult. It was difficult to get your product to market, right? Such that around 1800 or so, transporting goods 30 miles by road cost the same as shipping the same cargo all the way to England, okay, across the Atlantic Ocean. But then in the first half of the 19th century, in rather quick succession, you see the invention of the steamboat, canals, railroads, telegraphs that help open land or make it more practical to be able to settle land to the west. And when I settle, I mean settled by white Americans, right? Of course, the land's already been settled and still is settled by Indians for hundreds and hundreds of years. You see the lowering of transportation costs. It essentially makes it easier for Americans to get their goods to market. Okay. So I'm probably realizing I'm going to be behind my bullets already. Yeah, I mean, this market revolution in many ways is driven by changes in transportation and technology. I've gone over some of these points before already. In 1807, in one of the first major technological innovations, Robert Fulton doesn't invent the steamboat, but he shows how it can be used for practical purposes, right? Using steam to be able to power a boat, okay, that can go, and this is the important part, not only downriver with the current, but it can travel efficiently and effectively against the current, right? So you can have steamboats going up and down the Mississippi River, both with the current and against the current. Okay, he does this on the Hudson River when he demonstrates its practicality for the first time. And it makes upstream commerce on the country's major rivers easier and more rapid. Okay, so this will include the Mississippi River, also the Great Lakes region, up and down the Hudson River in New York. And this was especially critical to the West because it began to allow Americans to connect frontier farms to markets, right? Either in the east or down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and getting goods out onto the ocean that way. Okay. By 1811, let's get ahead here. Let's see, where am I? Oops, nope. Oh, I don't have that on a slide. By 1811, the first steamboat was introduced on the Mississippi River, and by 1830, over 200 steamboats were plying the waters of the Mississippi, okay, helping to get goods traveling up and down the Mississippi River, but also out onto the oceans through the mouth of the Mississippi, okay? And this helps to transform interior isolated agricultural areas into eventually more busy commercial regions, and connect those regions to other even more developed regions where there are markets for agricultural goods. Okay, in 1825, we see the opening of the Erie Canal. This is a major, again, technological innovation that would link the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. Okay, this is important, right? You have this canal which is built through upstate New York, dug out of the ground, connecting here. You can see the Lake Erie. That's why it's called the Erie Canal. No tricks here. Across upstate New York, right, connecting it to the Hudson River. And what does the Hudson River connect to? New York City, right? So it allows markets in the Midwest, agricultural regions of the Midwest, to use the Great Lakes to get products by water to the Erie Canal, and then across the Erie Canal down the Hudson River. Much easier to connect agricultural products in the Midwest now to New York, to the growing cities of the eastern seaboard on the United States, but also from there get those products out to international markets, primarily over to Europe. Okay. Now, this is a near visionary feat of engineering in New York. Self-taught engineers designed it. Gangs of workers, Irish immigrants, local farm boys, convict laborers built it, 364 miles from Buffalo to Albany. Okay. And again, allowing goods to flow from the Great Lakes regions to New York City. Okay. And this led to a bit of a canal building craze. Such that by 1837, you had about 3,000 miles of canals built in the United States, making transportation easier and cheaper. Okay. However, in some ways, the canals are supplanted by another mania, a boom, and that is the boom of the railroads, which doesn't really develop in a complex way really until later in the 19th century. But you have the first commercial railroads in the United States in the 1830s. By 1860, you have 30,000 miles of railroad tracks built in the United States on the eve of the Civil War, which again makes getting products, products that can be sold. It just connects the Midwestern, the interior part of the country, more easily to the east. So products can go to the Midwest, but also, more importantly, they can get their agricultural products out onto markets, both domestic and international markets. And also along this, usually accompanying railroads, were telegraphs. Telegraph technology developing in the 1840s, right? This is an old telegraph. I can't actually thinking of the term right now, but Morse code could be sent over these telegraph machines in which you use your finger and you type in dashes and dots in a code that could be sent near instantaneously across wires, or sometimes wires on poles, but also wires sometimes built into on the tracks. So you have near instant communication across the nation, again, which is ending the isolation of Midwestern farmers in the Midwest and further in the interior of the United States. So it's ending their isolation and connecting them to the east. Okay. All right. So these improvements in transportation and communication allowed the Western states, the rise of Western states and territories, to begin to rise as powerful economic regions of the United States. Okay, these changes help make farming, as I've already said, make farming in the West more feasible, more practical, and you begin to see the rise of commercial farming in the West, meaning people aren't moving to the West primarily making goods for their own use. It's sort of the way that farming had developed in the northeastern part of the United States way back early in the colonial period, where people were mostly self-sufficient, but they'd raise a diversity of crops for themselves, and then they'd use whatever surplus they had to buy other products that they might not be able to make easily on their own, like shoes or candles or what have you. And the same process is going on across the West as well. As these regions become more connected to Eastern and international markets, they're more enticed to grow more crops, even specialize a bit more in crops, and sell a lot more crops outside of their home, right? So gaining even more and more surplus, okay, to which they can buy things, right? And the population is growing, right? 4 million Americans have crossed the Appalachians between 1790 and 1840. And helps make the old Northwest, again, this is what we today would call the Midwest, covered by the Northwest Ordinance that we talked about before. It begins to become a powerful trading region in the United States. And the population in general is growing in the United States, not only people moving, but the population itself is growing. And you see the rise of cities, particularly in the North and the Midwest. The South does not, as we're going to see next time, does not. It does have cities in the South that tend not to grow and spread as much as they are in the North and the Midwest part of the country. In 1820, there were just 12 cities of over 5,000 people, but by 1850, only 30 years later, there's close to 150. So you can see there's a major process of urbanization going on here. And you see the growth of, really the birth of and growth of Midwestern cities that hadn't existed before. Right? Chicago isn't actually founded until the 1830s. St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Chicago emerge as, oh God, this is supposed to say, I saw this recently. I'm going to have to change it. I don't know why this says moves. I noticed it before. It's supposed to say nodes. It must have been some kind of automatic spell check. These cities emerge as important regional transport nodes, economic nodes in the American economy. So you have railroads and ports along rivers and so forth, in which these cities play an important part. Okay, these cities are associated with water, and in which, really, in world history, really many major cities that develop in any country usually sprout up along waterways, because it was, even going way back, it was much easier, even on flatboats, to transport goods along water than it is to do it over land. Okay. All right. So again, this is these last slides here were entitled demographic change, and there's another slide on demographic change here. Different kinds of people are also contributing to the growth in population. From 1790 to the 1830s is a rather low rate of immigration to the United States, and those that are coming tend to be, if not slaves, at least through the 1790s. They tend to be of northwestern Europe, particularly from the British Isles. But in the 1840s and 60s, you see a large flow of immigrants, about 4 million who are coming from Ireland and Germany. There are different push and pull factors here, as there always are in the decisions people make to migrate, whether they're primarily being enticed by opportunity elsewhere or being pushed out from problems in their home countries. Usually it's some combination of both. The Irish, in particular, in the mid-19th century, are suffering from a series of devastating potato famines. So a lot of starvation going on there. A lot of German states, and this is before Germany actually is one unified country. That doesn't happen until the process doesn't really begin happening until the 1860s into the early 1870s. Germans are really spread out among various German principalities, small German states. And there could be a lot of religious persecution, for example, in some of these. If you were a German Catholic, you might be living in a German state that is primarily Protestant, and you're being persecuted, and so you may want to leave to find economic opportunity elsewhere. And in the United States attracts a lot of people, as we're going to see throughout the 19th century, who are looking for economic opportunity. So you have a lot of Irish and Germans coming on, which again, from the American perspective during this time, is a form of diversity. We talked about this before. It seems kind of ridiculous from our point of view that Europeans are all that diverse from our current perspective, given the diversity of the world. But at the time, a lot of Irish and Germans coming into the country was something that other Americans noticed. They did look a bit different. They had different customs, different dress. And so from the American perspective, in the early 19th to mid-19th century, it was a form of diversity. Oh, sorry. So immigrants begin to become a major presence in rural and urban areas throughout the United States, and in the Midwest, and some Midwestern cities that are growing quickly. You actually have foreign-born outnumbering native-born in those cities. And even in New York City in 1860, almost half of the residents of New York City are foreign born. Okay, and this does cause something of a backlash. There are anti-immigration groups that sprout up in the mid 19th century, opposing all this influx of immigrants. Okay, and you can see here sort of the changing nature of the American population in this chart. You see the population growth here, and you can see it really starting to take off here, 1820, 30, 40, and 1850. So the increase in millions, percentages, but also you see this doesn't really show immigrants, but it does show the urban-rural change, right? You have in 1790, only 5% of the country is urban. 95% rural, and by the time you get, it's not a rapid change, but you can see that it has changed here over the course of about 60 years or so, where now you have in 1860 only 80% rural and more closer to 20% are in the cities. So there is a changing demographics here in which the country is slowly becoming, well, you could look at it as slow or fast depending on what you're looking at, but urbanization is taking place here at a noticeable clip. Okay. What we also see in the North during this period is a change in the nature of how Americans in the North produce goods, so, to some degree farming products, but we're really going to start talking about manufacturing goods here, but also in the way that Americans work, okay? As this population grows, you can see back here, this growing population, what is this going to mean? Well, it's going to mean people want more goods, right? More and more people, there's a demand for goods, and the old way of making things, like as artisans and small shops and cottage industries inside a home, for example, and where artisans made a whole product from on their own from beginning to end, like making a whole shoe, right? That is not going to satisfy these new markets, these new with this new demand, surging demand with all these population growth, both from natural increase and from immigration. And so, like I said, at one time when there were fewer people in the United States and there wasn't such demand for various products, skilled artisans produced goods in their homes or in small, or that you'd work in your own home as an artisan, or maybe you'd be an apprentice and you'd work in the home of a master. So a lot of work was done in the home, and in that environment, you could control your own pace of labor. You didn't need a watch. There wasn't a whistle telling you when to work, when to not. You didn't have to get permission from well, if you were a master, you'd say, hey, I'm taking my break now. But there wouldn't be this, these overseers looking at everything you did, controlling all your time. So you could decide not to work one day, and maybe you make up for it on the next day. You'd work twice as hard. But because of this greater demand, you have business entrepreneurs, capitalists who are beginning to decide, well, to meet all this demand, we need to make products more efficiently and more productively. You have to make more of them, right? And so you have capitalists who begin to establish larger workshops. They try to bring workers into factories. And so a lot of this happens in cities. This is part of what's contributing to urbanization in the United States, right? You don't build up industries in remote rural areas because you can't get workers there, right? So they tend to pop up around urban areas, and those urban areas then grow as these industries grow. And so people begin increasingly to work outside the home, being called in to work in factories, one among many workers, okay? And there's a constant demand for greater efficiency, right? And one of the ways you do this is you break the process down, right? This is the idea of, you break it into different skills, right? Division of labor. So instead of making a whole shoe as an artisan like you had, and you could take pride in making a whole shoe, you make part of the shoe, right? You make the sole of the shoe. Then you hand that sole off to someone else who's making another part of the shoe. And then there's someone else who pokes the eyelets into the shoe, right? And someone connects the shoe to the other, the sole to the other part of the shoe. You can tell I don't know a lot of the parts of the shoe. But in the end, a person could say, well, I don't know actually what I make. I don't make anything. I contribute to the making of a product, but I don't actually make a product like I used to. And so over time, the workers who had a lot of skills lose these skills. And some of them never have gained them. They begin work as an unskilled worker, and because they're only doing one part of a production process at any given time, they really don't develop that many skills. And they can be traded out for another unskilled worker at any time, right? And so it doesn't mean that this happens to everyone. There are still artisans today who make products a whole product and take their time with it. But there's a lot of demand for cheaper products that can be made through this process where there's a division of labor using a lot of unskilled workers. And you also see the rise of clock time. Right now, people have to keep track of time. You got to get to work on time. You can't go by the sun anymore because you can't be somewhat leisurely about it, maybe imprecise as to when you start, right? You got to be there on time. You have to take your breaks on time, only for a certain amount of time. You have overseers looking over you, making sure you're not taking any extra time, driving you to make as many products as possible, to be as productive as possible to meet the growing demand of American consumers. Okay. So what we see here is early industrialization in the United States, right, in the early 19th century. Okay. And this happens in the United States anyway. And it happened in Britain too, but earlier in this way. And in Britain is really where we see the birth of the Industrial Revolution. It's the textile industry. Different kinds of what in the Industrial Revolution is really in some cases is distilled down. It's marrying new technologies, new productive technologies, and with fossil fuels. Initially in the United States, it's actually water power, but in Britain, they begin using coal in the mid 18th century, right, to produce energy that will drive new machines that can make more than a single worker. So now a single worker can look out over various new textile machines that can create thread and weave clothing, right? And so one worker can oversee a machine that can do the work of, who knows, maybe 10 other, that would take 10 other workers to have made 50 years before, right? So again, making many more products much more efficiently, okay, to meet this great demand. And part of the problem for these early, and what happens in New England, it emerges in the United States and New England, they acquire, in some cases it's sort of industrial espionage in a way, acquire some new textile machinery. Right. Again, this is the kind of machinery and looms, industrial looms that can be one worker can do the work of what it would have taken many workers to do before. From England, from Great Britain, they use water power. New England is kind of rocky and it has streams and so forth that flow, and they can manipulate this water so that it will drive mills that will then power these machines. Eventually, later on, they will begin to use fossil fuels to create energy. But the problem a lot of these early factory owners had was recruiting people to work, right? Men tended, particularly those who had been artisans, do not see dignity in this kind of work in which you're just overseeing a machine and pushing buttons or spinning a wheel to make these machines go. They don't see it as dignified work that really requires skill, so they're very reluctant to do it. So what some of these early capitalists do is they try to recruit women, young women, to come work work on these in these textile mills, in these textile towns. One of the early ones is Lowell, Massachusetts, sort of northwest of Boston. And they'd have to do a lot of convincing. A lot of these families are wary of letting their daughters go outside the home, right, and meet the outside world without parental supervision. And so these factory owners have to do a lot of convincing, telling the families, we'll take care of your daughters, we'll oversee them, we'll make sure they do their work, but also give them things to do outside of work, but also stand in for you as parents and make sure that they don't misbehave, they don't get into trouble, and they remain wholesome, so to speak. By 1850, Lowell, Massachusetts had 52 textile mills that employed 10,000 workers, right? And many other cities across New England copied Lowell. And soon Americans began manufacturing goods using different forms of power, eventually fossil fuels, to produce and factory systems and new productive technologies to make guns, shoes, clocks, and others in great abundance to meet the demands of the American consumer. And so this Lowell system is sort of this system that they had of creating the textiles, but also taking care of the workers, these young women. And this is important for young women because They get some experience, a measure of freedom, experience with the outside world. They get to keep some of their own money, save up some money, and it paves the way for more women to work outside the home in the future. Right? Many of the women did not remain in this work for very long. They were expected to get married, and then once they got married, they wouldn't do this work. They would go and live in their homes. And eventually, you did have, as I mentioned before, you had these immigrants coming into the country, Irish and Germans, who are more willing, looking for economic opportunity, more willing to do this kind of factory work for wages, right? Well, again, a lot of the native-born American men were unwilling to do this because supervised factory work seemed to violate principles of liberty and independence. Remember how we talked earlier about how important it was for people to be independent workers, particularly to own your own land, but be an independent person and not being dependent on someone else for wages. Working for someone else per hour. And then when you add into that this is unskilled work in which you're not even making a whole product, it was very unappealing to a lot of native-born Americans early on. It wasn't until later in the 19th century, particularly with immigrants, that you saw men going into the factories to do this kind of work. Okay? So these sometimes called, you see this picture here, this is what Lowell Mills looks like, one of the early textile mills. This is a group picture of some of the so-called Lowell girls. You see here the women who worked early on as in these textile factories. Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm getting behind my bullets here. So yes, the factory system that emerges in New England spreads to other industries. You may see it in the book. It's sometimes unhelpfully called the American system of manufactures, which means the mass production of goods using interchangeable parts, so that you could things could be, you'd have somewhat reliable parts that you could just click in and make a product that way instead of having to make each part of the product individually, right? So it would speed the production process along. It wasn't really until the late 19th century where these interchangeable parts became really, really effective, really finely tuned. But you see the beginnings of it, particularly with the building of firearms, interchangeable parts. And why I say unhelpful with the Americans, that it's called the American system of manufacturers, I talked earlier in the last lecture on the War of 1812 about the American system. That is distinct. The American system is the idea of the federal government having a system to help for the federal government to help grow the American economy, a national bank, roads and canals, tariffs. That's the sort of the American system of building up a national economy. This American system of manufacturers simply applies to the manufacturing process. Okay. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about here. You're at mass production of using interchangeable parts. I really should say using interchangeable parts as opposed to of, which I'm going to change that right here, if you don't mind. Sorry. Using. So rapid assembly of products. It's speeding up production. Again, trying to meet this growing demand that this great population growth is calling forth in the United States. Okay. All right. So again, to sum up on this, and we have a little bit more to talk about, but on the market revolution, right? Big part of it is the transportation revolution, right? Which is making access to markets easier, making it more practical to populate the interior of the United States with Americans, and which of course leads to population growth, induces westward movement of farmers. You see the rise of commercial farming, and of course also see the growth of cities along these transport routes, in particular the Erie Canal. As they're building the Erie Canal in the 1820s, you see the growth of cities popping up like Rochester, New York, along the Erie Canal, right? So you have cities popping up along transport routes, waterways, what have you. And this growth of cities is also associated with the transformation in manufacturing, the early industrial revolution in the United States. Because one of the things that you need for an industrial revolution is you need workers, right? So you have cities growing up, you have factories going up in cities, and so those things tend to happen hand in hand. Okay. The last thing that I want to talk about is a few Supreme Court cases. Okay. And the reason that these Supreme Court cases are important is because they help establish, they're helping with this development of this market revolution in that it creates a truly national economy, right? And so it feeds in with the idea of an American system, right? Of trying to create a truly national economy. And there's some people in the United States who aren't particularly interested in this. They like the idea of economies and economic development being more state-driven. But there are others, like in the Federalist tradition, who want the federal government taking a major role and want federal government's policies and laws to take supremacy over those of the states, right? And that's when we're talking. SCOTUS here is just an acronym for Supreme Court of the United States. And the American economy, it's some kind of lame Star Wars thing here with the title Revenge of the Last Federalist. The Last Federalist here is really what I'm talking about is John Marshall, who after the demise of the Federalist Party in the 18 teens that I talked about last time, partly as a result of the War of 1812, is the last really major Federalist presence in the federal government. Right, John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court going back to the early 19th century. We first saw him when we talked about Marbury versus Madison, when he was asserting the principle of judicial review and giving the Supreme Court, or claiming for the Supreme Court, the power to interpret the Constitution when it comes to federal laws and state laws. And he's still around in the 18 teens and all the way into the 1830s, as we're going to see. And he's someone who, in his decisions, along with many of his colleagues who are also Federalists because they were appointed when there were a lot of Federalists, when the Federalists were in power in the 1790s, they are trying to assert federal power, right? To again interpret the Constitution in a broad manner, seeing in the Constitution, even though it's not stated explicitly, seeing implied powers that the Constitution gives to the federal government. Okay. And to give you 3 examples, and we won't spend too much time on these. The first one is Dartmouth versus Woodward in 1819. Now, this is in some of these cases, often these cases on first blush, you don't understand. You might not understand. Well, why the heck does this have to do with anything we're talking about? Usually, it's the principle behind the details of the case in particular. The details aren't that important. It's the major principle that's being asserted here by a particular decision, and that's what's going on here in Dartmouth versus Woodward. This involved Dartmouth College, which had a colonial charter, right? A charter is usually some kind of authority that a state or government will give to the creation of a corporation or other kinds of institutions like colleges, right? And the New Hampshire colony had granted Dartmouth a private charter to create a university. So Dartmouth University or Dartmouth College, I should say, is a private college. And what happened was the New Hampshire government in the 18 teens wanted to make it into a state university, state-funded university. They wanted to change its charter and make it an arm of the state government. Those who did not want this, who were Dartmouth College, wanted it to remain private, sued. The case made its way to the Supreme Court, right? And the Supreme Court decided, no, the state government cannot do this. The old colonial charter is a contract and cannot be altered or rescinded. Okay, so it's saying that the Constitution essentially protects contracts, and therefore, and because this charter is a contract, the state government is very limited in the way that it could possibly change this contract. Right. So again, it's giving powers, or it's protecting property in essence, protecting business arrangements from tinkering by states. Okay, remember that's one of the reasons that some of the Founding Fathers had wanted to change the Articles of Confederation in the first place to protect property. In part, this can include not only physical property but assets that you may hold, loans. Remember, the Shays' Rebellion came out of the concern that some of the Founding Fathers had at that time was that some of the states were eliminating debts, which was debts were the property. Someone who held the debt was owed that money, and if you canceled the debt, it meant that person wasn't going to get his or her money back, right? And so that was an assault on private property, and many of the founding fathers had wanted wording in the Constitution that would help protect property. And this is what this decision is doing. It's limiting the power of states, okay, to interfere with private economic business, contracts, debts, assets, things like that, okay? So it's important, again, in asserting the power of the federal government to regulate and limit what the states can do, limiting how they can regulate economic activity, okay? The second case is McCulloch versus Maryland, also in 1819. Now remember, I talked last time that the Second Bank of the United States comes into being in 1816. So it's a second bank, has a 20-year charter, but it still has a lot of opponents, and some of these opponents were in Maryland who were not happy about this Second National Bank. And the bank itself was, it had a central headquarter bank, but it also had branches in different states. Okay, and what the Maryland legislature tried to do was to tax the transactions of the Second National Bank. So the Second National Bank, through its transactions, would owe the state of Maryland, its Baltimore branch, would owe the state of Maryland money. Okay, the Second National Bank sues, and again, it makes it to the Supreme Court, and John Marshall does two things in his decision. One is he reaffirms the theory of implied powers, because he says the Second National Bank is a legitimate national institution, and even though nothing in the Constitution says that the federal government can create a national bank, there are implied powers in there giving the United States government the power to do this. So again, broad construction of the Constitution, and its legitimacy is reaffirmed by the Supreme Court of the United States. It also said that the taxes themselves were not legitimate, okay, because it was basically the states were then interfering in the regulation of interstate commerce, which is something the federal government was supposed to do, right? The federal government institutions were not dependent on the states, could not be regulated by the states. As Marshall put it, Americans did not design to make their government dependent on the states. Okay, so again, asserting federal power over states. And the last one is Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. This involves a steamboat monopoly that the state of New York had granted to someone to have a monopoly over steamboat traffic around New York City. Well, this interfered with another steamboat operator who had gotten a charter from the federal government in the 1790s to operate steamboats in and around the waters of New York, New Jersey, and so forth. That area, those waterways. And the court ruled in favor of I can't remember who's who here, which one's which. But it ruled in favor of of Gibbons. Gibbons is the one who has a license from Congress, a charter from Congress. It rules in his favor because the federal government had jurisdiction over interstate commerce, right? And therefore, the nationally granted charter would rule here and supersede the state-granted steamboat monopoly. So again, it's vindicating federal power, federal jurisdiction over interstate commerce. All three of these decisions are efforts by the Supreme Court, at least, to try to bolster federal power in relation to state power when it comes to designing an American economy, right? To try to build up a national economy. Okay, so still debates throughout the United States among those who believe in federal power to help with economic development and those who oppose it. And we're going to get to more of that later on. But with that note, I'm going to end here. Next time, we'll be looking at a similar kind of economic transformation, but in very different ways, right? The market revolution as it plays out in the South. So there's a market revolution going on. The South benefits from it, but in very different ways than the North did. Okay, so we'll look at that next time. Thank you. Goodbye.